You know that moment when the sun starts rising, everyone around you pulls out their phones, and there's one person who just watches it with their actual eyes? No photo, no angle, no urge to turn the moment into proof. And suddenly, the whole group looks at them like they just admitted something strange. You're not on social media? Yeah, that person. But that person isn't a technophobe, they're not a hermit, and they're not disconnected from life. They might actually be protecting something most people have already lost without realizing it. Because the moment every beautiful experience becomes something you have to capture, caption, and share, something changes. Your attention splits, your presence weakens, and little by little, your life starts feeling less like something you live and more like something you prepare for other people to witness. So if you've never felt the urge to document every meaningful second, if posting your life has always felt vaguely exhausting, if part of you has always wondered why everyone else seems so comfortable performing their existence for strangers, you're about to understand that this may not be a flaw in your personality at all. It may be a psychological difference, and in a world that keeps confusing visibility with connection, that difference stands out fast. And that's where this gets interesting, because the real question isn't why social media works. Of course it works. The better question is why it doesn't work on everyone the same way. Social media taps into one of the most primitive needs in the human brain: social validation. The need to be seen. The need to be approved of. The need to feel like your life means something in the eyes of other people. And when you post something and people respond likes, comments, shares, your brain gets a hit of dopamine, the same reward chemical tied to craving, pleasure, and reinforcement. That isn't an accident. These platforms were built by engineers who understood behavioral psychology well enough to make attention feel urgent, unpredictable, and hard to put down. But people who don't use social media are not somehow above dopamine. They're not more evolved, they're not less human, and they're not immune to reward. They just seem to get that reward from somewhere else. Their brains appear to be less driven by external validation and more satisfied by internal experience. In other words, they don't need 200 people to react to a moment for the moment to feel real. The experience itself lands, and once that starts happening, something important changes. You stop needing the audience to tell you what was worth feeling. Once you see that, something else starts to make sense. It's not just that some people use social media less, it's that they seem to want something different from experience itself. Take something simple like a vacation. Two people can stand in the exact same place, looking at the exact same ocean, and walk away with two completely different feelings about what just happened. One person takes the picture, posts it, checks who saw it, notices who responded, and only then does the moment start to feel complete. The other person doesn't need any of that. The trip was worth taking because they took it. The view was enough because they stood in front of it. Psychologists describe this as intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Some people are more driven by what an experience feels like on the inside. Others are more influenced by what comes back from the outside. And that changes everything. Because once you stop needing other people to confirm that a moment mattered, the whole game changes. You're no longer asking strangers to validate your life while you're still in the middle of living it. For some people, the experience is the reward. For others, the reaction is, and this is where social media starts doing real damage. Because it was never only about connection. It was also about comparison. Every time you scroll, your brain is quietly measuring your life against everyone else's. Your ordinary day against their best day. Your unfiltered reality against their edited version of reality. And you can never win that comparison. Because you're comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. The awkward parts they didn't post, the doubts they cropped out, the moment before the smile, the life behind the performance. But your brain still reacts as if what you're seeing is the full picture. That's the trap. A study from the University of Pennsylvania found that limiting social media use to about 30 minutes a day significantly reduced depression and loneliness. And people who avoid it even more often tend to report lower anxiety and higher life satisfaction, which makes sense. The less often your mind is pulled into constant comparison, the less often your life gets framed as inadequate. You don't lose because your life is worse. You lose because the system keeps placing your real life next to everyone else's polished version of theirs. And after a while, even a meaningful life can start to feel like it's not enough. And the effects don't stop with comparison. They also show up in the way attention starts to behave. Because social media gives your brain a very specific pattern to get used to: frequent novelty, rapid shifts, and small rewards delivered at unpredictable intervals. And over time, that can change what holds your attention and what doesn't, not because your mind is broken, because attention adapts to what it practices. That's why it can become harder to stay with slower forms of experience, to read a book without reaching for your phone every few paragraphs, to sit with one thought long enough for it to deepen, to remain present with anything that doesn't immediately stimulate you back. There's research pointing in that direction too. Heavy social media use has been linked to weaker focus, poorer impulse control, and changes in prefrontal patterns related to attention and decision-making. So this is no longer just about time, it's about conditioning. The more your mind gets used to constant interruption, the less natural, uninterrupted attention can start to feel. And that has consequences, because a mind trained to expect constant stimulation can begin to struggle with ordinary reality, not because reality has become empty, but because it no longer arrives in fast enough pieces. That's the deeper cost. Social media doesn't just compete for your attention, it teaches your attention what to expect. But this is where the story gets more complicated. But here's where this gets uncomfortable. Not everyone who stays off social media is doing it from a place of strength. Some people leave because they've seen through the game, and some people leave because being seen feels unbearable. Those are not the same thing. There's a difference between intentional solitude and fear-based isolation. From the outside, they can look identical. No account, no posting, no participation. But internally, they come from two completely different places. One is peace, the other is self-protection. One says, "This doesn't serve me." The other says, "I don't know if I can survive being visible." Because sometimes people don't step away from social media because they're free. Sometimes they step away because they can't tolerate the feeling of being watched, judged, ignored, or measured. And then they call that distance a principle. When sometimes it's really just defense. That's the harder question underneath all of this. Are you opting out because you no longer need the game? Or because the game can still hurt you too easily? Did you leave because you were clear? Or because disappearing felt safer than exposure? Those are not the same kind of absence, and they don't come from the same kind of freedom. Stepping away from social media can be wisdom, it can be self-possession, but sometimes it's just a quieter way to hide. And if that's true, the real issue isn't the platform, it's the pain you were trying not to feel. And once you see that, it becomes harder to romanticize what social media really is, because a lot of it isn't actually social. It's performative. Every post is a tiny audition for approval. Every story is a subtle negotiation of status, image, and perception. And after a while, you stop asking whether something felt real. You start asking how it looked. That's the shift, and it matters. Because the moment connection becomes something you manage, shape, and optimize, it stops being connection in the deeper sense. It becomes theater. This isn't connection. This is theater. Real connection happens somewhere else. It happens in the pause before someone answers a difficult question, in the laugh that comes out too loud and can't be edited, in the ordinary moment that would look completely unimpressive online, but somehow becomes unforgettable in real life. That's what people who stay off social media often understand, not always consciously, but intuitively. They understand that some of the best parts of life are the parts you never think to post. The parts that don't photograph well, the parts that don't sound profound in a caption, the parts that mean everything precisely because no one was performing them. And once you realize that, the whole platform starts to look different. Not evil, not forbidden, just strangely incapable of giving you what it keeps promising. And when people step away from that, they don't just lose a platform, they get something back. First, they often get deeper relationships, not more relationships, deeper ones. Because their social energy is no longer being scattered across old classmates, passive followers, distant acquaintances, and people they haven't truly spoken to in years. It goes to the people who are actually in their lives, the people in front of them, the people they can call, the people whose silence means something because it's happening in the room with them. And then there's the time. By the latest global estimates, the typical internet user now spends well over 2 hours a day on social media. That adds up to more than 860 hours a year, roughly 36 full days of life every year. And people who stay off social media get more of that time back to read, to think, to make things, to get bored long enough for a real thought to arrive, to exist without feeling like every moment is being silently evaluated for its shareability. But the deepest thing they get back may not be time. It may be presence. Psychologists sometimes call it continuous partial attention. That state where part of you is here, but another part of you is still scanning for the next interruption. One eye on the moment, one eye on the phone. And after enough of that, you can be physically present almost everywhere while being fully present almost nowhere. People who stay off social media escape more of that split. When they're with you, they're more likely to actually be with you. Not half listening, not mentally composing a caption, not turning the moment into content while the moment is still trying to become memory. And somehow, society treats that like it's strange. You're not on Instagram? How do you keep in touch with people? As if human beings didn't maintain closeness for thousands of years before platforms taught us to confuse access with intimacy. And this is where it gets uglier. Because social media doesn't just distract you. It can start teaching you to experience yourself as something marketable. That's why so many artists, writers, and creators say the same thing when they step away from it. Their work gets better. Not always bigger, not always faster, not always more profitable, but better, more honest, more focused, less contaminated by the constant pressure to anticipate reaction. Because the work stops being about performance and becomes expression again. And that shift matters far beyond art. Because social media quietly pushes everyone toward the logic of branding. You're not just living your life, you're curating it, editing it, framing it, marketing it. You start managing a version of yourself for an audience that is often made up of distracted strangers, half-interested acquaintances, automated accounts, and people who do not actually care as much as the numbers make it seem. That's part of what makes FOMO so powerful. It keeps people locked inside a system they already know is draining them. Not because everything online is meaningful, but because the system is very good at making meaningless things feel urgent. Most of what people are afraid of missing online is noise. Digital noise. And the things that genuinely matter, real invitations, real relationships, real moments of contact, usually find their way to you whether you're scrolling or not. But the algorithm is not organized around meaning. It is organized around engagement. And engagement responds most reliably to a certain kind of emotional trigger: envy, outrage, insecurity. In other words, the system works best when you feel slightly behind, slightly excluded, slightly not enough. Because not enough is profitable. That's the part almost nobody says out loud. Social media doesn't just compete for your attention. Over time, it can start training you to look at yourself the way a product is looked, at something to improve, something to optimize, something to package, something to display. And once that happens, it's no longer just a habit. It becomes a slow erosion of identity. And the final cost may be even more personal than that. Because when you live too many moments in performance mode, you don't just lose attention. You can start losing memory. There's research suggesting that when people focus too much on documenting an experience, they often remember it less clearly afterward. Which makes sense, because part of the mind is no longer inside the moment. It's already outside of it, framing it, capturing it, thinking about how it will look later. That's not presence, that's performance. And over time, that changes something subtle but important. You stop building memories. You start building content. Now, this is not some anti-technology sermon. Social media is a tool, that's all. And like any tool, the real question is not whether it exists. The real question is whether it is serving you, or whether you are slowly reorganizing your mind, your time, and your identity around serving it. Because the moment a tool begins deciding what is worth noticing, worth sharing, worth remembering, it is no longer just helping you express your life. It is starting to shape it. And that's really the point. This is not about saying social media is evil. Some people use it well, some people use it lightly. Some people can step in and out of it without losing themselves. That's not the issue. The issue is whether your attention, your time, and your mental energy are being spent consciously or quietly drained by a system that benefits every time you forget what they're worth. People who stay off social media are not better than anyone else. They have just made a different choice. A choice about what gets access to their mind. A choice about what gets to define a meaningful moment. A choice about whether life has to be witnessed to count. And if you've made that choice, or if some part of you has been wanting to, you do not owe anyone an explanation. You're not weird. You're not antisocial. You're not missing out on life. You may be one of the few people still trying to live without an audience. Maybe the people who left social media didn't leave life behind. Maybe they just stopped performing it. And if this part of you has been hard to explain, maybe that's exactly why spaces like Psyche-Life matter. A place for people who are trying to understand themselves a little more honestly. So if this gave language to something you've felt for a long time, stay close. Leave a quiet like if it spoke to you. Subscribe to Psyche-Life if you want more of these reflections. And if you've ever felt this tension yourself, tell me in the comments, not for performance, just for truth.